Hello everybody, and I'm here to talk to you about carbon sequestration in geotechnical structures. So first of all, I'm not an engineer, I'm more a plant guy, so I'll try to keep this presentation simple, not a lot of results, but some practical outcomes that I got from my overall research without going into too much into the details of mechanisms of what is happening into the soil. And I would like to start from a very famous question, that it's how do I reduce the carbon footprint of my project? So this is you, the engineers, these are the CEO, and we have seen that a lot of people are working on that right now. We have seen some really interesting presentation yesterday from a private company on how to reduce the carbon footprint of projects, and all of them, they were focusing on reducing the output of CO2 or greenhouse gases into the atmosphere. So changing the use of materials, moving less the soil, taking it like closer from where you're building. So I actually I would like to pose a question, but why instead we don't sequester the carbon that it's already in the atmosphere back into the soil? So why we don't actively sequester the carbon from the atmosphere and put it into the soil? So soil carbon sequestration in geotechnical structure could be a nice, valuable option to reduce the carbon footprint. How does soil carbon sequestration works? So very simply, you have an input of carbon. Plants fix the CO2 from the atmosphere through photosynthesis to create the lignin, the cellulose, the sugars, everything. It's composed of carbon, of course. We are as well, but we cannot take it directly from the CO2. We just eat the plants. And then this carbon that it's in the tissue of the plants, it's passed into the soil mainly via two ways. The first one, it's the turnover of the plant. When the leaves fall down, when the roots die, you have this biomass that it's in the soil, this dead biomass in the soil, and then the root exudates. Actually, the plants, they release these sugar compounds from the roots. A lot of them, they can arrive to the 30% of the daily photosynthesized carbon that it's moved into the soil via root exudates. And this carbon that arrive into the soil enter another part of the carbon cycle. So it can be consumed, so actually eaten by bacteria, fungi, the micromesofauna, and respire back in the atmosphere. It can be protected inside of aggregate or via organomineral interactions in the soil. So this is the stable carbon in the soil. Actually, this is not a two-way, but the carbon that is consumed by microorganism, it's exudated by microorganism as well. It's what we call microbiological bioproducts, and these microbiological bioproducts can be protected as well. Finally, you have the output of carbon from the soil system, that it's through respiration of bacteria and fauna, micromesofauna, and respiration of the roots of the soil. Of course, to increase carbon sequestration in soil from plants, you want to increase the input of the plants in the soil. You want to increase the protected carbon into the soil, and you want to decrease the respiration. You want to decrease the output from the soil back into the atmosphere. So, bearing this in mind, I would like to talk to you 1 second about the carbon quality. So the carbon, when you move it into the soil, it can be unprotected or protected, as we're saying. So the unprotected carbon, it's the little piece of leaves, of roots that are free into the soil. These can be consumed by the microorganism and can be respired or moved to the protected aggregates, to the protected fraction. When you have instead the protected carbon, actually the carbon it's moved inside microaggregates, and the microorganism cannot physically reach the carbon, or it can be absorbed on silt and clay minerals, forming what we call organomineral interactions. And again, this carbon cannot be consumed, or this carbon cannot be consumed by microorganisms. So you will not have consumption. So of course you prefer this protected carbon to the unprotected carbon for soil carbon storage. I would like to make you an example of research right now in soil carbon storage. It's the 4 per mille, 4 per mille program. It's an initiative that was presented by the French government to the COP21 in 2015. Basically what they say is that we have, of course we all know we have high emission of CO2, but we have a huge carbon pool in the soil. It's actually the second biggest after the minerals. And just increasing the soil carbon pool of the 4 per mille, you would be able to store all the excess of carbon of the atmosphere into the soil, back into the soil. This is the idea behind it, but what I would like to drive your attention to is that they just talk about farmlands, meadows, forests. They just talk about agricultural soils or natural soils. They never talk about anthropogenic soils. They never talk about geotechnical soils. And I think this is a pity for two main reasons. So the first one is that the geotechnical soil, they don't have economical constraint. In agricultural soil, you cannot try to maximize the carbon input into the soil, because what you're trying to maximize is the production, is the economical value, it's the fact that you need to feed your family with this soil. You cannot just think about the carbon. Instead, in natural areas like forests, wetlands, there are ecological constraints. There is already a carbon cycle inside, and you cannot try to move the balance toward the soil without having problem in the ecological balance in these areas. Instead, in these geotechnical soils, we can actually choose the plants and the soil to achieve the best carbon sequestration possible. So I think that it's a good idea to try to use them as much as possible for this reason. So, well, now that I convinced you, of course, you're wondering, okay, but how do I do that? So what is more important, the plant or the soils? What plant should I grow to maximize my carbon sequestration in the soil? What soil should I use? If I have a poor soil, something that happens in geotechnical soils, a mine, a quarry, an embankment with poor soil, will my plants grow? Should I strip some topsoil and put it on top to increase the soil organic carbon sequestration? Can I just put my plants on it? So I'll try to answer these two questions for you. No, I'm not going to answer them, but we can discuss them a bit. So let's talk about the plant selection first. We had these Talveg experiments in which we compared the soil organic carbon sequestration by 12 different herbaceous species used to revegetate embankments in south of France. We wanted to compare the leguminous species with gramineous species because they have very different root characteristics. So leguminous species, they have a higher biomass, higher root biomass, so higher input. They have a higher activity, a higher exudation. So this is my input of carbon, it would be higher in the leguminous species. But the input of carbon, it's labile. So the carbon of these leguminous species, it's labile carbon, it's rich in hemicellulose, while the gramineous species, they have a lower input, but it's rich in recalcitrant compounds like lignin or cellulose. What's happened is that when you have a labile carbon, the microbes will use it more efficiently, will eat it faster, and will respire more of it back into the atmosphere, while if it's recalcitrant, it will be more difficult to consume for the microbes. It's like if I give you some grass or a biscuit, you will prefer the biscuit and not the grass. So this is the idea for the for the microbes. So these leguminous species, moreover, they stimulate microbiological activity even because they form some symbiosis with rhizobium bacteria that are nitrogen-fixing bacteria in the nodule of the roots. So you have even a microbiological boost given by these species. So I'm gonna to tell you, so how much carbon, what is the quantity of carbon stored by these two different species, and what is the quality of the carbon. Regarding the quantity of the carbon, you have the gram of carbon per gram of soil, so it's a percentage for now. You have the best performing species are Trifolium pratense and Lotus corniculatus, two leguminous species, that in average, leguminous species, they perform better than the other, but you need to select the right one, because actually the other two leguminous species, they perform the worst. While instead the Poaceae species, that are the gramineaceous species, they are a little bit here in the middle. So we have leguminous, especially these two species that we would like to investigate more. What about the quality? Talking about the quality, you have the unprotected carbon and the protected carbon. In the unprotected carbon, the higher increase can be found in the gramineaceous species, the one that have the recalcitrant carbon input. While instead the protected carbon, it's higher for the Fabaceae species, for the leguminous species, that one that have the higher labile carbon input. So what's happening here is that we have two different mechanisms for carbon storage, for the carbon quality storage. So you have Fabaceae species that have a very high input of carbon, of labile carbon in the soil. So they boost the microbiological activity. The microbes consume a lot of this labile carbon and move it to the protected fraction via these microbiological bioproducts that interact with the microaggregates in the soil, even in the formation of the microaggregates in the soil, and with the silt and the clay forming organomineral interactions. While for the Fabaceae species, you have a lower input, but you have a very low microbiological activity. You have a more recalcitrant, unprotected carbon pool in the soil that will not be consumed by microbes and moved in the protected fraction, so you will increase the unprotected carbon. So what we found is that the leguminous, the Fabaceae species, they have a higher input and it's protected carbon, so we like them. Moving on to the soil selection. So in geotechnical soils, I think it's not unusual to revegetate poor soils. It can be the case of a quarry, the soil restoration programs. And in my case, I was focusing on the embankment. So when you build an embankment, you have the core of subsoil, then you have the proctor compaction and all this more geotechnical stuff. And then a lot of time you cover it with stripped topsoil that you take into the area, you put it aside and then you cover again. And I was wondering, what if you don't use with this stripped topsoil? What is you plant the species directly on this subsoil? It could be interesting for, I think, different reasons. The first one, it's economical and environmental benefit. Fertile soil, it's a limited resource. So we should use it for agriculture, we should use it for nature, we should use it for different objective, I think, than a geotechnical structure, probably. And then, if you have to bring this topsoil from an area, you will have a CO2 impact of the transport of the soil. And then the second one that it's pretty interesting, it's the carbon saturation. So subsoil could be more interesting for protecting carbon in the soil due to the carbon saturation. What is carbon saturation? Basically, if you increase the input of carbon in the system, the increase in soil organic carbon in the soil especially in the protected fraction, so the organo-mineral interaction, it's not linear, but actually it has a saturation point where it cannot grow anymore. So if you have a lot of carbon at the beginning, so for example topsoil here, with the same amount of input, the potential increase in carbon in the soil, it's low. While if the subsoil has a very low initial carbon content, the potential increase in carbon in the protected fraction could actually be higher than the one in the topsoil. And why is that? I was telling you about the organo-mineral interaction. Of course, you have active surface of the mineral, usually with the aluminum, iron, manganese, that form this organo-mineral interaction. So let's say that this is a topsoil, you have a limited amount of possibilities for this interaction to form. If instead in the subsoil I have, and these are already occupied, in the subsoil I have lower amount of carbon, then I have a higher amount of possible interaction that can be created into the soil. So this is the idea behind the carbon saturation. So we design an experiment. It's kind of complicated. We use isotope and blah, 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 but that's not the point right now. Just remember that we compared the carbon, the organic carbon sequestration between topsoil that was excavated by the first 30 centimeter and subsoil from the same, excavated from the same profile at more or less 1 meter, from 1.1 to 1.4 meter depth. You have two species, Medicago sativa, that again it's a leguminous, while Lolium perenne it's a gramineaceae. Then you have bare soil control. So same two questions of before, how the soil will influence the carbon storage, the quantity of carbon stored in the soil, and how it will influence the quality of the carbon. So here, what I expect is that I will have a higher increase in the topsoil because I have a more fertile soil, so I have a higher input. But actually, regarding the quality, I expect a higher amount of protected carbon in the subsoil because I have a lower initial carbon saturation. So let's look at the quantity. This is the carbon stock, the carbon increase, and this is subsoil and topsoil. Bare soil control, the Lolium, and the Medicago. And this is the zero. So what we are observing is that actually soils are losing the subsoil independently from the vegetation that we put on in. It's losing carbon instead of increasing. Same thing for the bare soil of the, so for the control, if I don't put plants on the topsoil, it will lose carbon as well. While if I use the Lolium, you have a slight increase, and instead, if you use the Medicago, again, you have the best increase in carbon in soil. So this is due probably to the disturbance of soil, to the priming effect, to the fact that you mix the soil, you add water, you kind of awaken the microbiological community that start consuming more carbon because they were there at 1.5 meter depth, they were doing their stuff. You bring them up, you put water, you put nutrients, and they start consuming more carbon, decreasing actually the amount of carbon that it's exactly what we don't want. Regarding the carbon quality instead, I would like you to observe only the white and the red. Here you have the topsoil and the subsoil. The white is the unprotected carbon in the control, in the Lolium, and in the Medicago. And regarding the unprotected carbon, you have the same increase in topsoil and subsoil. And that was surprising to me because you have a lower input of carbon in subsoil. How it's possible that the increase is the same? Instead, in the protected carbon, I was expecting a higher increase in subsoil, if you remember, and I observed the opposite. The higher increase was in topsoil. In subsoil, the increase was very low in the protected carb fraction. So why is that? Again, due to microbiology. In topsoil, I have a high microbiological activity. So I have this unprotected carbon. It's consumed by the microbe in the soil, and it's transferred in the protected fraction. In the subsoil, instead, I have this input of unprotected carbon that it's not consumed from the microbes in the soil, and it's not transferred to the protected fraction. So you have in proportion a higher increase in unprotected carbon in the subsoil compared to the topsoil. So actually, I had my hypothesis was not correct, and due to the lower microbiology, you don't have an increase in the protected fraction of subsoil. So when you are wondering what is more important between plant and soil, probably we are forgetting about the microbes in the soil that are actually the engineers that are transferring the carbon between the different fractions of the soil. There is a central law of microbiology. In both the experiment, we observed that with the higher microbiological activity, you have a higher carbon protection. Then there is a secondary role of the soil that it's more connected with the fertility of the soil that will influence the carbon input, and less with the carbon saturation. However, I'm not saying that the concept of the carbon saturation it's wrong. I think it's true, and you have nice experiments that prove it, but you don't observe this in the natural world, because in a natural situation you have other processes that are more important, that come first compared to carbon saturation. That is the microbiological transport, the input of carbon due to fertility, and all of these different things. And then a tertiary role of plant selection with the best performance of leguminous. So as an engineer, what should you do with your geotechnical soils? First of all, you should always revegetate them. We have seen that without revegetating the soil, you will lose carbon. So it's actually going to be a source of CO2 instead of being a sink of CO2. Then you need to consider the soil health and its fertility. So when you have a poor soil or a subsoil, I would suggest, but more studies are needed on that, to inoculate with microbiological community to favor this transfer of carbon from the unprotected to the protected fraction, and even to boost the soil health, the soil. It's good to have a good microbiological community in your soil. So remember to inoculate. And then, for revegetation, I would suggest you to use leguminous species, especially Trifolium pratensis and Lotus corniculatus. They have a higher quantity and a better quality of carbon input. But how much? So I have calculated that 1 kilometer of highway with the 2 embankments of 5 meters each, that it's total of 1 hectare of soil, could store potentially 30 tons of CO2 every year. I started to compare it with the carbon footprint in different geotechnical projects when building highways. At the beginning, I was not very satisfied, because I found a paper that was saying that for the construction, you actually emit 7,000 tons of CO2 in 1 year. So in 1 year, with this rate of carbon sequestration, you could actually sequester only the 0.2 of the emitted carbon. But however, that's the nice thing, it's not a process that stops, it's a process that goes on with the time. So in 10 years, if we assume that it's a linear increase, that it's not, we need modeling of these, but it's just for discussion, you could store back in the soil almost 2% of the CO2 that you output in the atmosphere. But then I went on with looking for other projects that analyze different stages, that use different materials. And what I found is that when you have a LCA study, the numbers of the emission of CO2 equivalents per tons per kilometer, they vary a lot. So with the same amount, with the same revegetation of embankments, actually, in 1 year, you could store, for example, here in this project, the 0.5%, but in this project in Sweden, I guess they're very good in sustainability in Sweden, you can store back the 23% of the emitted carbon. So I think that using vegetation for soil organic carbon storage in a geotechnical project can be a very valuable option for reducing the impact of the project, together with all the other practices, good practices and sustainable practices that we discussed in these days. To conclude, there are a lot of future research, I think, use of amendments in soil for the carbon saturation, the inoculation effect of different bacterial or fungi strain, the different soil management, mixing topsoil and subsoil. There is a need of modeling, so I think it's an interesting area to explore this geotechnical structure and soil organic carbon sequestration. That's it, thank you.